We're now just going to have a quick, Tobias, if you'd like to come. We're adding a bonus session. In the last 36, 48 hours, there's been a lot of talk about tariffs. So we're absolutely delighted to have, I don't even know if you've got your presentation ready. We agreed this about an hour ago with Tobias to take us through actually what would be the impact of tariffs. We're not going to talk about whether tariffs work or wrong or the economic effects. What we're going to talk about is what happens if tariffs come into place. And obviously you've all got 30 days before you even have to worry about this. But let's imagine the US had enacted tariffs on Canada and Mexico today. What would it mean if I'm importing a new and Bombardier aircraft into the country?
Okay, so thanks, Al, and thanks for having me for this sort of impromptu session. So let me tell you sort of how it works now without the tariffs, right? So if you're importing goods into the U.S., you know, you've got to have a customs broker, you give them power of attorney, they collect all sorts of statistics and information to give to U.S. Customs. Airplanes are no different than toys and clothing. All merchandise that comes into the U.S. has to be imported, you've got to make entry, you've got to get a bond, and pay duties and taxes and fees. And with aircraft, right now there's no duties and taxes, but there are fees. And it's 0.3464% of the value, or $634.64 or something like that. And you've got to make a formal entry. It's a very carefully controlled process. And when the aircraft lands, you got to have your bond in place and you get your shipment cleared, and then you can go on your way. If the tariffs were enacted, it was only going to impact coming into the U.S. Canadian manufactured goods. I mean, you know, China doesn't make airplanes, Mexico doesn't make airplanes. But it wasn't just new airplanes coming from Canada, it was used airplanes coming from Canada or anywhere else. So you could have been buying a 10-year-old Challenger coming out of Europe, and when we make that electronic entry into the automated commercial environment, they ask for the country of manufacturer, and it would have been Canada, and it would have been subject to the tariff. Now, 25% on the import value, that money has to be paid to customs very quickly. The customs broker, we generally collect it and we pay it on behalf within a few days. But you know, when this happened on Saturday and we said, okay, we have till Monday night to figure this out, you know, the problems that I started to think people were going to have is, you know, how do you deal with a contract that's already been written? How do you deal with lease agreements where there's no provision for tariffs for the return of an aircraft back to a lessor? Dealers that have you know, a purchase agreement in place and a buyer on the other end, and there's a markup, but there's no provision for tariffs. So we dodged a bullet, and we've got 30 days, and hopefully they're not trying to extract something else from Canada or Mexico. And then, of course, you had the retaliation, you know, U.S.-made goods going to Canada or to Mexico. You know, the optimism that you're hearing this morning, I think would have been a little bit less. Yeah, well, everybody's worried. So we as an industry need to be prepared for this. Hopefully, as Stephen said, it's a negotiation for other things that they want to get. But you know, what happens when you have the next ask and the next ask, and at some point the price is too high. So
I'm quite impressed though. So the U.S. customs system
Yes.
is ready. It would have been ready to work within.
It would have been messy, but they would have stopped shipments at the border and said tariffs are owed, and then someone's got to come up with the cash.
And typically now you do that. You'll put the bond. You'll pay the bond? on an aircraft?
We will get the importer of record a bond, so they're the ones responsible for paying it. Now, that's the other issue, the bond. You know, a bond right now, a customs bond, is $200 for a $50,000 bond to cover a $634 fee. But when you have a $2.5 million tariff due, that bond is insufficient. And the underwriting to get a bigger bond where there's real money at stake, they're going to want financials from the importer. They're going to want a letter of credit. Well, can you get financials for a special purpose entity that's buying the plane? That's difficult. Can you get a letter of credit from a bank? I mean, there's just so many questions, and that's going to take time to get the bond in place, and time kills deals. So, like I said, we dodged a bullet. But yes, I think customs would have been ready, and not just for our tiny little, world of business aviation, but the millions of containers coming across the border full of, all manner of goods.
So Franco from Wolf Aviation, who headquartered in Mexico City, has asked a very good question. What happens to aircraft with Canadian manufactured engines?
That's a good question, Franco. I don't know, but I do know that it covered all goods manufactured in Canada. So Pratt & Whitney engines probably would have been subject to tariffs. When we make an entry, we give the make and model of the aircraft. It's not like a lease where you specify the make and model of the engines as well and the serial numbers on the engines. So I'm not sure that would have been, if you had I'm not sure how that would have been handled, quite honestly. But so it's a good question I don't know the answer to. We didn't have enough time to get more guidance. There's something called the Federal Register Notice. We were waiting for that to see if there was more clarifying language and guidance, and we just never got that far. So, thankfully.
And Charles has asked, how would tariffs work with components crossing borders multiple times?
Yeah, another good question. Components, imported into the U.S. from Canada would have been subject to the tariffs for, parts. And then, of course, if they're going back over with, as part of U.S. goods, again, we just didn't have enough time to understand what was going to happen. So I wish I had better answers, because
no one's blaming you.
It came and went so fast that we should all be thankful that it came and went so fast.
And Rowley from Rowley Vince and Associates and JetNet IQ is asking, so the tariffs would apply to the total value of a new aircraft?
I think it's safe to say it would have been the total value of the new aircraft. Because when we bring aircraft in, there's a commercial invoice or a pro forma invoice, and they say, what is the purchase price, or if you don't have a contract, there's a valuation method for determining the value. So I think it's safe to say it would have been the total value of the goods imported.
I had no idea that it applied to pre-owned. That was when we were doing.
That was I was talking to someone 2 weeks ago who said, "Well, we're thinking of importing a plane," and I was like, "Oh, I think it'd be a stretch to apply to used," but that's what our read of it was. We have a outside customs attorney, and she called me on Saturday and said, "My read is this is going to impact your business, and it's not just new goods coming from Canada. It could be a used aircraft coming from wherever." So it was. It would have been a real problem. And, again, all these transactions that are already in process, it would have just been a big problem for lots of deals that are in process. And I think that, if the industry, this is a learning moment, people should be looking at their contracts and how they're written and adding language in them, how to deal with duties, taxes, fees, tariffs, who's responsible. Trade compliance in general should be addressed in leases and purchase agreements and so forth, so that if this does happen, we're better prepared.
And I'm not going to ask for specific advice, but one solution could be, if I'm taking delivery of an aircraft, I just register it in Aruba or San Marino or Isle of Man
It doesn't matter where it's registered. If it's being brought into the U.S. to be consumed in the U.S. and based in the U.S., it's going to be subject to.
Temporary admission?
So there is something called a TIB, Temporary Importation Bond, but it's not really. So when you import something under a TIB, you can't technically sell it. So usually people use TIBs to bring an aircraft in for like maintenance or something like that. So you couldn't say, we're going to use a TIB, but bring it in for consumption. I think that would be a problem.
So if I am a charter operator with a Bombardier aircraft that's already in, if I've already imported it once, these aren't retrospective.
If the aircraft was already in the U.S. and imported, no problem. It's what was coming after midnight of last night.
Yeah. And I guess the obvious question, has the threat gone? Is it all, does everyone need to worry about this?
So I just want to know what's going to happen in 30 days, and I don't know if anybody knows the answer. So.
How would this impact people who had purchased fractional shares? Because I would think that it's the fractional operator that's taking delivery of the plane and then the owners. So does this, who's paying the tariff on that? I guess, is it the fractional operator to start?
So the person responsible for the tariff is the importer of record. So when we make an entry, the entry has two parties to the entry. You have the importer of record, and you have the ultimate consignee, which in the U.S. would be a buyer. So it's a little complicated, but if you have a foreign seller, they can be the importer of record, the U.S. buyer can be the importer of record, and it's generally negotiated. Now, if someone buys an airplane in Europe and brings it home, it's logical that they would be the importer of record because they're bringing their airplane home. But when you bring an aircraft to the U.S. for, say, a pre-buy, it's not yet closed. The seller can be the importer or the buyer can be the importer. We can make a foreign company an importer and get them a bond. The buyer might say, hey, we don't want to be the importer because, we still haven't accepted the airplane. We might reject it and then it's going to go back. And, if you're the importer, you're subject to a 5-year customs audit, look-back period. On the other hand, a foreign seller could say to a U.S. buyer, yeah, if you want our plane, you need to be the importer because we don't know how to deal with this. So it's a negotiated point. But in the context of fractional, I would imagine that the airplane would be imported by the fractional provider that's buying it and then selling the shares. And then if there was a tariff, I got to believe they'd say, we got to mark up these shares to cover the tariff that we weren't expecting. And that's the problem when you have agreements that are already in place with no provisions for how to deal with it.
Are you hearing or seeing any rush to get airplanes that are close to completion imported into the United States and within this 30-day period?
Well, so on Saturday, I knew of 2 that needed to get here pretty quickly, and there was a scramble to try and get them here today. And when they called off the tariffs for 30 days, I think everybody sort of calmed down. But I have a feeling those airplanes are still coming in the next 30 days, just in case. But they already have agreements in place. They were coming anyways. It was just, we better speed up and get them here.
And we've got Angus just there.
That was a handoff. That wasn't a proper. What's the prudent position for someone to adopt in this 30 days? Should they be continuing to work up as if these are coming in so that they're prepared, or should they not be wasting time on something that is perhaps never going to happen?
I guess it depends on the situation, right? I mean, if if someone has an aircraft under agreement and they know it's coming to the U.S. in the next couple months, I would say, you probably want to get it in sooner than later, because you just don't know. I mean, I wish we had more certainty. That's the problem. We just don't have that certainty.
It reminds me very much of what was going on around Brexit. It seems a similar situation. You've got presumably the worst possible scenario being used as a negotiating tactic, and nobody knowing what's going to happen until everything's all decided. And in the meantime, businesses are left to, see which way they believe the wind is blowing and try to do what they think is best for them. But it's going to end up with an awful lot of people wasting an awful lot of time.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is...
Yeah, but also a lot of people getting a lot of money to do it, so it's not too bad.
What's that?
You'll get a lot of money for doing this. So
No.
It's not, we've got a question.
I guess plan the best you can, and keep it in mind that it's a risk, potential risk.
Who's next? Oh, sorry, we've got another question in the row in front, I think, as well.
Yeah, so we were looking at this. You have a couple clients that are facing multi-million-dollar tariffs. I mean, worst case scenario. I mean, if you time it properly or improperly, you're going to pay the tariff. It's in the agreement, and so that's the problem. Worst case scenario, you could park it in an offshore registry for a while and just don't import it into the United States, and when this all dies down, then bring it in the United States.
Yeah, I suppose you could. I mean, just don't bring it into the U.S. until you can. I suppose that's certainly a possibility.
Do we have a question at the back? Mike, we've also got one, just a few. Have you got a question? Mike, just 2 rows in front of you. He's not throwing it for you. It's like...
Yes, okay, going back to the question about tariffs, now that we're in the Trump era, I believe the standard fractional ownership agreement, if it's done by a proper lawyer, generally gives the buyer the fractional owner prices, but makes it very clear that all additional taxes, tariffs, and so on are for the account of the buyer, in which case it's the fractional owner. But I agree that it can become a negotiation point if the tariff is much larger than either side ever expected. So these are sort of new risks that we'll be facing if any government suddenly imposes a huge tariff. I mean, I guess the fractional owner can claim for force majeure. Yeah. What do you think?
I think if it's defined in the agreement, then it's going to be between the parties to that agreement to who's responsible for it. And I think the trouble is when it's not defined in an agreement or it's not clear. I mean, you could say, I was talking to Scott McCreary about this. He was saying, well, is a tax a tariff? And then there's a debate on, does the tax, does that language all encompass tariffs if it's not specific? So, depends on the agreements, and that's why I suggested earlier that people should look at their agreements and make things a little bit more clear if they're not clear.
And I think we've got one question about aircraft outfitted in the US. I'm guessing from Dasso.
Aircraft outfitted.
So if you fly an aircraft in green, presumably you can argue a lot of the aircraft's value.
Well, for a Dassault, it's not Canadian manufactured. It's about the country of manufacture.
I think we're assuming the EU is going to get tariffs.
Okay, if that happens, and we've got to worry about that too, I guess.
Good.
What are they trying to extract?
Great. Well, what I'd like to say is congratulations. You've managed to scare 89% of the audience. So well done. And coffee's outside. Thanks, Tobias.
Thanks, Al. Appreciate it.